the SDS and the Weather Underground. And then to wrap things up, Trevor Loudon, who, like I said, his book here, I encourage you to get as many copies as possible, Barack Obama and the Enemies Within. A little bit about Trevor, very quickly. Trevor Loudon is the foremost researcher of the progressive movement. He's investigated these liberals for quite a while. A broad group of anti-capitalists that include Democrats, Republican moderates, socialists, communists, peace activists, the religious left, most organized labor, and environmentalists. Trevor's research has formed the basis for explosive news stories about America's radical left and has been cited extensively in books and articles by Aaron Klein, Brannon House, Dr. Jerry Corsi, co-author of Unfit for Command, and many others. Trevor's diligent efforts have also provided the background material for many of Glenn Beck's groundbreaking TV and radio exposés. It was Trevor Loudon who first exposed the Obama administration's green job czar, Van Jones, as a self-described communist, leading to Jones's expulsion from the Obama White House. It was Trevor who first discovered that the Frank mentioned in Obama's autobiography, Dreams from My Father, was in fact the Communist Party USA member Frank Marshall Davis. It was Trevor who exposed Obama's early membership in the so-called New Party of Chicago, a communist spin-off group. Trevor has so many firsts, they are impossible to list. And now, with no further ado, a great American patriot from New Zealand, Trevor Loudon.
Well, thanks very much, folks. Thanks for having me here tonight. It's great to build on Bill's work, and thank you, Paul, for having me here, and Pastor Ernie for getting me into your venue. The first thing people ask me is why, as a New Zealander, I should care about the internal politics of your country. And I say there are two simple reasons. First is gratitude, because my country was only saved in World War II because of the huge sacrifice of your fathers and grandfathers and uncles in the battles of Guadalcanal, the Coral Sea and Midway. Second reason is related, but it's a little more selfish. Ronald Reagan had it right. This is the last best hope of mankind. If freedom fails in the United States of America, it fails everywhere. If you lose your world leadership and your military superiority, the bad guys of this planet, Russia, China, Iran, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, North Korea, and all of their allies will carve up this planet amongst themselves. Now, I come from way down in the bottom of the South Pacific, and I'm always getting emails from Americans saying, if Obama gets back in, can I come and live in New Zealand? I could start an immigration consultancy, I honestly could. But I always say to them, look, come down for a holiday, you'll love it, but there is nowhere to run. This is the front line. 1,500 miles to the north of my country lie the beautiful Fijian Islands. Wonderful tourist destination, but they now have a Marxist-led government. The Chinese are training the Fijian military and are building big hydroelectric dams on the islands. So Fiji is now a Chinese client state. And that's happening right throughout the South Pacific. Just a few months ago, the Australian Minister of Defence was up in China for talks, and a top Chinese defence official embarrassed him publicly. He said, now is the time for Australia to choose. Do you stay under American protection or do you come under Chinese protection? And that kind of threat would not have been issued under Bush or under Reagan, probably not even under Clinton, but it's being issued now because the bad guys of the world are getting bolder and bolder because of the leadership they see coming out of your White House. And all around this planet, your allies, from Israel to Taiwan to Japan to Australia, are freaking out because they see that your president loves the bad guys more than he loves them. And that's causing a lot of instability and a lot of worry, a lot of uncertainty all over the globe. It's causing a big shift in the global balance of power. And if it continues, your president, the man who continually cries peace, will lead you into war. A war that you may not win. So, I want to start off by talking about what I call the central secret of communism. And it's very seldom discussed, very seldom written about. You hardly ever hear about it. It's not atom bomb spies or Occupy people or Labour Union agitators. It is the ability of a tiny Marxist-Leninist party to get their policies implemented as the law of the land in their country. So isn't that ridiculous? How possibly could a small bunch of comrades, maybe a few hundred strong or a few thousand strong, how could they possibly influence public policy in a country of 5 million or even 150 million voters? How could it be done? Well, I want to start out with an example from my country, New Zealand. Back in 1984, we elected a socialist Labour government. One of the very first things they did was to enact legislation banning nuclear warships from our harbours. And as you guys were the only people sending nuclear warships into our harbours, overnight that destroyed the Australia-New Zealand-United States military alliance. ANZUS killed it stone cold dead. And it's still dead today. So how come, at the height of the Cold War, how could a pro-Western, pro-American country like New Zealand so willingly turn its back on the Western alliance? Well, this is how it was done. Now, a few years after that, I had the privilege of interviewing over several months a New Zealander who had infiltrated the New Zealand Communist Party for our security intelligence services. He was a government spy inside the Communist Party. And in 1983, he was given the greatest honour any communist could enjoy. He was sent to Moscow for training at Lenin's Institute for Higher Learning in Leningradsky Prospect. Now, this was not a small place. This was 3,500 communists, some of them on 7-year courses, some of them with one-to-one tutelage. This was the training academy for the future world communist leadership. And there were people there from Sri Lanka and Taiwan and Egypt and South Africa and Nicaragua and Venezuela and Canada and Luxembourg and everywhere. Virtually every country was represented except for one. And that was the main enemy itself, your country, the United States. So how come no Americans were training there in Moscow? Because at some point, your government had told the Soviets that were any Americans ever caught training there, there would be war. And the Soviets respected that, but what they would do, they would train Mexicans or Canadians or New Zealanders in the doctrines they wanted promoted, and those people would go and train the American communists. So my friend sat down in a little room with the other 3 members of his delegation, some people from the KGB, people from the Soviet Communist Party, and tutors from the Institute. And they had a plan, and it was a very, very important plan. Because this was the time of the massive anti-nuclear marches through Europe. Hundreds of thousands of Europeans were marching through their capitals weekly and monthly, hundreds of thousands strong, waving big banners against NATO, against the nuclear arms race, against the nuclear umbrella over Europe, against America. Hundreds of thousands of them calling for the end of NATO, the North American Treaty Organization, which you guys are the linchpin of. And there was a real fear in many government circles that NATO was about to break up. And of course the Soviets were funding these marches and funding the communist parties who organised them because they wanted NATO to break up, because that would give them a free hand in Europe. And as then, in those days, as today, your military and your military alliances are Moscow's #1 target, because nothing else stands between them and what they want, which is basically everything. So the Soviets were thinking, well, we've got this going on, we've got these marches going on, We can break up NATO here if we push this. But how about, to stir this movement along, how about we break away another country from outside of Europe, from the Western Alliance, because the psychological impact and the propaganda value of that will help us destroy NATO. So they chose New Zealand to experiment on, because we're small, socially liberal, progressive, and the communists were very strong. They controlled our labour movement, they controlled our peace movement, and they had heavily infiltrated our Labour Party. So they were thinking, well, we need to do this, we need to get New Zealand out of ANZUS. But we can't, we've got a problem. We can't sell this as an anti-American thing like we do in Latin America or Europe, because New Zealanders love America too much. So we're going to have to sell this differently. We're going to have to, this is going to be a pro-New Zealand thing. This is going to have to be a patriotic Kiwi thing, because Kiwis are what we call ourselves, after the little bird, not the little fruit. Okay? Those little fruit used to be called Chinese gooseberries, and you could buy them for 10 cents each. Then we rebranded them as Kiwis and sell them to people for $2 each. So it's smart. Okay, so they thought, how are we going to do this? Okay, this has got to be pro-Kiwi. They worked out the slogans, they had marketing people there, they had psychologists there. So this is going to have to be Kiwis standing up for peace. Kiwis standing against the nuclear arms race. New Zealanders striking an independent foreign policy course. All patriotic, chest-thumping stuff. So they worked out the slogans. This little delegation went back to New Zealand, held secret meetings with the Labour Party, with the unions and the peace movement. They mounted a big campaign, and a few short months that legislation was in front of our Parliament, it was signed off, and our military alliance with you was dead. Just like that. And I will tell you, if you talk to any New Zealander today about our anti-nuclear stand of 1984, which is still in effect, they'll puff out their chests with pride, and they'll say, yeah, we did it, we stood up for peace. And not one of them hardly in 4 million would have any idea that that anti-nuclear stand was designed by the KGB at Lenin's Institute for Higher Learning. Totally duped. But could this happen in America? Possibly. If I told you that 10 years ago, would you believe me? Some of you would. Okay, well I'm going to give 2 examples. I want to start with a small symbolic example for a start, out of California. Every year, the lucky Californians, the ones who are working that is, get a day off work to celebrate, paid day off work, to celebrate the life of the great labour union leader, Cesar Chavez. Day off work. Cesar Chavez, the man who was trained in Chicago by the Marxist agitator Saul Alinsky, the man who worked with communists and socialists his entire life, the man who marched under the famous banner, "Se puede, yes we can." Some of you might have heard that one before. And Obama acknowledges exactly that's where it came from. But the woman who got that pushed through is a Southern Californian named Evelina Alarcon, leader of the Cesar Chavez holiday campaign. Now she got a whole bunch of left-wing movie stars and a whole bunch of labour union people and all her friends in the California state legislature. They mounted a big campaign and she got it passed. And now she's since got it passed in 10 more states. And now she wants to do it nationwide. And her website proudly lists the endorsement for her campaign from your president, Mr. Obama. Mr. Obama was in California 2 weeks ago making Cesar Chavez's home into a national monument. But I'm sure Mr. Obama had no idea, and I'm sure most Californians had no inkling, but Evelina Alarcon was the long-time leader of the Southern California Communist Party USA. But she has changed legislation in 11 states. So, what about a big, meaty, grunty example? One that's going to affect every single American. One that stands to socialise between 1/6 and 1/4 of your economy. Not hard to figure out, is it? Obamacare. Now, I acknowledge that Obamacare is not yet fully single-payer or socialised healthcare, but we all know where it's going to head if it's allowed to stand, and it cannot be allowed to stand.
California? I said California.
Yeah. Well, the father of the single-payer socialised healthcare movement in this country is a retired Chicago physician named Quentin Young. Now, Quentin Young's pushing 90 now, but he's been working on this issue since the 1950s. He set up numerous doctors' alliances, radical groups all over the country, worked with the Canadians, worked with state legislators, worked with congressmen, members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, like John Conyers, to promote this legislation. But it was only in 2009-2010, with the Affordable Health Care Act, that he finally started to make progress. But it's not surprising the progress was made under President Obama, because for many years in Chicago, Quentin Young was Barack Obama's personal physician. He has openly claimed credit for indoctrinating Obama into the ideas of socialised healthcare. But more than that, Quentin Young was a 40-year veteran of the Communist Party USA, until he left that organisation to set up a new Marxist group, the largest Marxist group in the United States, called Democratic Socialists of America. If you want to know about them, you ask Dennis Kucinich about them. He'll tell you all about them, and the Communist Party. But anyway, if you think the Democratic Socialists of America, and Sherrod Brown too, by the way, if you think the Democratic Socialists of America sound a bit democratic and a bit, they're only socialist and they're sort of pro-American, one of their leaders is a man called Kurt Stand, now serving a 17-year jail sentence in your country for spying for East Germany and the former Soviet Union. And speaking of that group, the Obama campaign just released a video designed to embarrass Mitt Romney. And they said, basically, guess what, Mitt? The man who designed your Romney Care was a Massachusetts state rep named John McDonough. It's not quite accurate. John McDonough did design it, but Mitt Romney modified it extensively. And then they said, well, guess what, Mitt? We brought in John McDonough and he designed Obamacare for us. And this is the Obama campaign saying this. But what they don't say is that John McDonough was for many years the Boston chair of Democratic Socialists of America. So basically a Marxist designed Obamacare. And this goes on all the time, folks. You think the Democrats done it. But I'll tell you how the Democrats get their policy. Basically, the labour unions are key, and the Institute for Policy Studies is key. Because basically, the Institute for Policy Studies and the communists come up with a policy. They come up with the policy they want for America. But the communists and the Institute for Policy Studies dominates the Congressional Progressive Caucus. The communists dominate the labour unions. So what they do, the communists make the policies they want into labour union policy, because they control them. The labour unions go to Democrat Party conventions and put that policy forward and vote on it and make it Democrat Party policy at every level, state and national. They also elect Democrat reps. And there's hardly a Democrat in this country that does not owe his job to the labour unions. And since 1995, when John Sweeney, a member of Democratic Socialists of America, became president of the AFL-CIO, every major labour union in this country has come under the control of the Marxists. SEIU, ASCME, NEA, you name it, they run it. So it's simple. Communists set a policy, make it labour union policy. The labour unions make it Democrat policy. Cap and trade, card check, comprehensive immigration reform. Obamacare, all of it started as communist policy. All of it. If you want to know what the Democrats are going to do tomorrow, you read the Communist Party USA's People's World or Democratic Socialists of America's Democratic Left. Because what's in their pages today will be on the floor of your State House tomorrow, or on the floor of your Congress next year, promoted by the Democrats. This is not the Democrat Party of Harry Truman or John F. Kennedy, as many people still think. This is the Democratic Party of the Communist Party USA and Democratic Socialists of America. They control it, together with the IPS. So, we look at Mr. Obama, you know. A lot of people say to me, they say, didn't Mr. Obama make a great movement? I say the opposite. I say a movement made Mr. Obama. Now, is there anybody here from Chicago that dares to admit it? No? I'll say what I want then, okay? Well, South Chicago. The movement that created Obama started in South Chicago in the 1950s. Now, South Chicago is a pretty bleak industrial area. But there's a little oasis in the middle of it, a little green oasis called Hyde Park, the area around the University of Chicago. And it's full of trees and nice cars and nice condos, squirrels and socialists. Absolutely chock full of them. Now, back in the 1950s, the communists and socialists of Hyde Park, working through the Democrats, decided they wanted to take on and take out the corrupt daily Democrat machine that ran Chicago. So this was Marxist Democrats versus gangster Democrats. That was basically it. So what they did, they thought, well, to do this we have to broaden our base. So the Marxists and Socialists of Hyde Park formed a big alliance with the blacks of South Chicago, the Latinos and the labour unions. So communists, socialists, Democrats, blacks, Latinos, labour unions. Does that sound familiar at all? That is the blueprint of the Obama machine. That's where it started. And the first person they got elected was a man called Leon Dupre to the Chicago City Council. A lawyer, practiced till he was 100 years old. And in his last years he was a close friend and a mentor to Mr. Obama. But back in the 1920s, Leon Dupre used to go down to the local rifle range in Chicago with his best friend Saul Alinsky to practice rifle shooting, target shooting for the communist revolution that they believed was just around the corner. In the 1940s, Leon Dupre was going down to Mexico City to visit with Leon Trotsky, the exiled Soviet leader, then hiding out from Comrade Stalin. The next person they elected was in 1983. They got a black lawyer named Harold Washington into the Chicago Mayoralty. Harold Washington was a long-time Communist Party supporter, and he stacked his administration from top to bottom with Marxists. Absolutely stacked it. The next person they elected was in 1992. They got a woman called Carol Moseley Brown into the US Senate. And eyes always roll when I talk about Carol. No, very corrupt, a long-time Communist Party supporter, almost certainly a secret Communist Party member. She only lasted one term, and then your President Clinton made her an ambassador from your country overseas. And guess where he sent her? Worse than Russia, he sent her to New Zealand. We got a corrupt Chicago communist sympathiser as our representative from your country. A great honour. Thank you, Mr. Clinton. The next person they elected was, of course, Mr. Obama himself to the Illinois State Senate in 1996, though there's a story to that one. Then in 2004, they got Obama into the US Senate from Illinois, and in 2008, by using their networks across the country, they put him into the White House. And Mr. Obama knows exactly who put him into power, and he is fulfilling their agenda every day of his term of office. Every day. So why is Mr. Obama so happy to work with the Marxist left? The people we thought had all shriveled up and gone away to die years ago. Well, really, that's all he knows. He has only ever worked with the Marxist left. From the time he was a little boy right up till today. His cabinet is full of them. He's put them all through his administration. And who here has heard of, before tonight, heard of Frank Marshall Davis? About half of you. Well, Frank Marshall Davis was a black guy. He became quite famous in Chicago in the 1940s because that was the time of the jazz era, the time where the black left was a very vibrant movement. And I say left, like left, but I mean left, right, okay, the black left, the Marxists, the socialists. Now the black left was a very vibrant movement in Chicago. It was very cool to be a communist at the time. Frank Marshall Davis was a full-fledged member of the Communist Party, a member of the Dory Miller Club of the Chicago Communist Party. And he was very well up in the left. He was a big deal in Chicago. A poet, a journalist, a writer, a jazz critic. He was a very cool guy. But in 1948, he left all of that behind and moved out to a little backwater in the Pacific called Hawaii. And it was a backwater in those days, before the tourist trade, before statehood. Why would he do that? Well, a few years before that, Comrade Stalin had ordered the American Communist Party to put as many comrades out into Hawaii as they could. And what do you think interested Comrade Stalin in Hawaii? Well, what interested the Japanese in 1941? Pearl Harbor. Most important military base in the Pacific. And I repeat my claim. As then, as today, your military is Moscow's #1 target. And Comrade Stalin wanted as many spies as he could get in Hawaii to monitor Pearl Harbor and as many agitators as they could get to get the bases closed down. At one point, the communists in Hawaii even hatched a plot to stage a revolution on the islands and hand the bases over to Stalin. Didn't quite work out, but that was their sentiment. So out in Hawaii, Frank became a journalist. He worked for the Honolulu Record, a labour union publication. And his boss was a man called Koji Ariyoshi, Japanese-American communist. He had worked with the United States Army during World War II in China with Mao Zedong's communist armies against the Japanese. After World War II, Ariyoshi went to New York where he worked with the Amerasia people. The Amerasia was a left-wing magazine staffed by communists and several known Soviet spies who were working with the secret communists and your State Department to tilt US foreign policy away from Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist pro-American Chinese armies towards Mao Zedong's communist armies. And because they succeeded in getting your government to withdraw military support for Chiang Kai-shek, 500 million Chinese were delivered to the communists. A small bunch of American traitors changed world history, as they have done on many occasions. Something similar happened in Vietnam a few years later. Frank Marshall Davis, the man, a lot of leftists, a lot of liberals, they say, yeah, he was a civil rights campaigner. You know, McCarthy picked on him, for his civil rights campaigning. Frank Marshall Davis was the subject of a 600-page FBI file. 600 pages. The FBI were watching him for 19 years. And they were very concerned about Frank because they were getting reports that out in Hawaii, he was often seen photographing obscure Hawaiian beaches with a camera with telescopic lenses. And I think they suspected military espionage on behalf of the Soviet Union because they put Frank Marshall Davis on the security index. That was reserved for only the most dangerous communists. and meant that had war ever broken out with the Soviet Union, Frank Marshall Davis could have been arrested that very day. So about 1970, young Barry Satoro, 10 or 11-year-old boy, moves from Indonesia back to Hawaii to get an education at his exclusive private school. And his maternal grandfather, a guy called Stanley Dunham, decided that the little Barack really needed a black mentor, someone to guide him through the teenage years. So he picked out his dope-smoking, whiskey-drinking buddy, Frank Marshall Davis, to do the job. Now this was the man who wrote poems praising the Red Army, articles viciously criticising racist KKK America, the man who regularly used to call in his columns your Democrat President Harry Truman. He often called him a fascist because of Truman's opposition to communism. So this was a man who had the ear of your president for 8 or 9 of his most formative years. And Mr. Obama refers to a man called Frank 22 times directly and a whole bunch more indirectly in his book Dreams from My Father, as a guide, a mentor, someone he discussed politics with, someone he turned to for advice, career advice, etc. He's a very important man to Mr. Obama. Just read his book. But Mr. Obama only calls him Frank, never his full name. And knowing how transparent and open your president is, doesn't that seem strange? Didn't seem to want it known that his mentor was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party, a man who was on the FBI's security index. And some people say to me though, they say, yeah, by that time Frankie was just a dope-smoking old alcoholic, no big deal. But as late as 1979, the year Obama left for Occidental College, Frank Marshall Davis was still listed as an endorser of the American Committee for the Protection of Foreign-Born, the Communist Party's main front at the time. 2 names below Frank Marshall Davis was listed another comrade, a man called Hugh DeLacy. And I'd like you to remember that name for later in the talk. So Obama leaves Frank, goes to Occidental, works with the Democratic Socialist Alliance there, goes out to Columbia, New York, attended the annual Democratic Socialist organised Socialist Scholars Conference. 2,000 people gathered in a hall, foreign communists, Black Panther radicals, radical feminists, gay activists, Marxist labour unionists, all gathered in a big hall, plotting how to bring your country to its knees, and Mr. Obama was right in the middle of it. Then Obama goes to Chicago, inspired, as he says, by the election of Harold Washington, the black Marxist mayor. Then he goes to Harvard to get a law degree, and while he was at Harvard, both he and later Michelle were befriended and mentored by Charles Ogletree, one of Harvard's top law professors, a former supporter of the radical communist Angela Davis, former member of the Maoist Black Panther Party, veteran of a Marxist student trip to Cuba in the 1970s. So then Obama goes back to Chicago, and he's got his eyes set on politics. And the woman who got Mr. Obama his first job in politics and mentored him for several years was an Illinois state senator named Alice Palmer, a black woman. And she and Obama both worked together in the New Party, as Bill mentioned before, a radical group set up by the Institute for Policy Studies, Democratic Socialists of America, ACORN, and the SEIU Union. And their job was to infiltrate the Democrat Party in Chicago and move it further left. And when I exposed Obama's membership of that in 2008, the Obama campaign flatly denied he'd ever been a member, despite massive documentary evidence to the contrary. Obama wasn't just a member, he founded it. He helped to set it up. But in 1996, Alice Palmer decides to run for Congress. And she employed Mr. Obama as her chief of staff. And the deal was this: Barack, you get me elected to Congress and you can take over my state Senate seat. And it was Alice Palmer that took Mr. Obama to the famous meeting in Hyde Park in the drawing room of Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dawn, where the underground terrorist leaders from the 1960s, Quentin Young, the doctor, was at the same meeting. That was Obama's introduction to the Hyde Park left, the people who started the movement in the 1950s. But things don't always go smoothly in politics, and Alice Palmer lost the primary. So she turned to Mr. Obama and said, "Sorry, Barack, but you're going to have to step down. I need my state Senate seat back." And Obama says, "Tough, Alice, I'm running." And he got her disqualified off the ballot by challenging her signatures, many of which were fraudulent. Even in Chicago. Fancy that. Then he got all the other opponents disqualified the same way, so he ran unopposed. But that caused a big stink on the Chicago left, and a communist named Tibby Black was brought in to mediate, a friend of both Obama and Alice Palmer's. But even he couldn't sort it out. Obama was dead set, and the two parted their ways. But it's fair to say that Alice Palmer was another significant mentor to your president. She had a little bit of a history. Back in 1980, she was invited to Grenada in the Caribbean by Maurice Bishop, the communist dictator of that island, to the first anniversary of that country's Marxist-Leninist revolution, the celebrations marking it. And the invitation cards are in my book. In 1983, Maurice Bishop was murdered by some of his own comrades, and in the ensuing chaos, your President Reagan sent troops onto the island to sort it all out. And my friend was studying at Lenin's Institute for Higher Learning when that happened, and the Soviets were absolutely livid. They were spitting tacks because bloody Ronald Reagan had shut down what was going to become the second Cuba of the Caribbean. They were not happy. So, the same year, Alice Palmer was in Prague, communist Czechoslovakia, for a meeting of the World Peace Council. Now, that's very significant because the World Peace Council was then, and it still exists today, the Soviet Union's #1 international front. They put billions of rubles into it. They had affiliates all over the world, and its job was to propagandize against and agitate and undermine your military. Their #1 front. It campaigned against Star Wars, it campaigned against NATO, against your military bases all over the world. Everything your military tried to do to improve the security of your country or its allies, they tried to undermine it. And in many cases, they were very successful. It was a World Peace Council affiliate in my country, New Zealand, that helped to destroy ANZUS. And when my friend was training in Moscow, just to illustrate, he was sitting down with Comrade Venedev, one of the tutors from the Institute, and they were discussing the peace movement and how they're going to use it to scam New Zealand. And Comrade Venedev said, "John," said, "there are many brilliant people in the Soviet Union, but no one has yet come up with a weapon as powerful as the peace movement. That is the store the Soviets put in their peace movement and its ability to undermine your military." And Alice Palmer also served on the United States, the National Executive of the United States Peace Council, the US affiliate of the World Peace Council, also still exists. She served alongside 16 members of the Communist Party USA. And a woman called Barbara Lee, who is now a Democrat congresswoman out of California. And when all the California Democrats were going for Hillary in 2008, guess who the first one was to stand up and endorse Mr. Obama? Barbara Lee. So, Alice Palmer was also running the Black Press Institute out of Chicago, a nationwide network of black communist journalists whose job was to sow Soviet propaganda amongst your country's black population and to explicitly work with your Congressional Black Caucus. your leftist black congressman. Direct channel from the Soviet Union through Alice Palmer into your Congress. In 1985, she took 16 of these people to Prague, to East Germany and the Soviet Union for meetings with high-ranking government officials and the editor of Pravda. In 1986, Alice Palmer was in Moscow covering that year's annual conference of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The same year, she was elected North American Vice President of the International Organization of Journalists, another bona fide Soviet KGB front, an international front. And her job was to monitor activities for the Soviets in Canada, the United States, Mexico and the Caribbean. So to put it bluntly, Alice Palmer was a high-level Soviet agent of influence, intimately connected with 3 Soviet bloc governments and 2 major Soviet international fronts, plus the Communist Party USA here. So Frank Marshall Davis, communist, possible Soviet spy, anti-military activist. Alice Palmer, Democrat, Soviet agent of influence, anti-military activist. 2 of the key people in your president's early career. But what about the people around Mr. Obama today? And I'm going to give you my full presentation tonight, if you can stand it. Because I'm not going to keep you here till 4 o'clock in the morning talking about all of them, the ones I know about. I'm going to pick on 3 that I consider most important. And the first one, even the Liberals call her this, the other half of Mr. Obama's brain, Valerie Jarrett. The woman who introduced Obama to his wife and basically sits in the White House today as his closest friend and most trusted advisor. Easily the most powerful woman in America. But what about her background? Where did she come from? Well, Valerie Jarrett's mother is a woman called Barbara Bowman, child psychologist out of Chicago, runs a thing called the Erickson Institute. Now that's an early childhood education outfit. It's had a lot of influence in early childhood education in your country. In 2009, President Obama gave Barbara Bowman an award for her educational work, and that ceremony was prominently covered in the pages of the Communist Party's People's World. The Erickson Institute, named after Erik Erikson. Anybody remember the phrase, identity crisis? Leave him alone, he's having an identity crisis. That was Erik Erikson. He was a disciple of Sigmund Freud. But he was also expelled as a professor from Berkeley University in the 1940s because he refused to sign an anti-communist loyalty oath. He was a lecturer at the time at the California Labor School, the Communist Party's main trade union school in California. He was also, while on the board of the Erickson Institute, have served Tom Ayers, the father of Weather Underground terrorist Bill Ayers, and Bernadine Dawn, the wife of Bill Ayers, a famous terrorist in her own right and a long-time friend of Mr. Obama's. Valerie Jarrett's maternal grandfather, Robert Taylor, first black head of the Chicago Housing Authority. Back in 1940, he was affiliated with the American Peace Mobilization. Wonderful sounding organisation, the Communist Party's main front at the time. And you know what their job was? It was to keep your troops and your government out of World War II. Out of World War II. Peace. No war. And why were they doing that? Their slogans were, no American troops for Europe. Let Europe solve Europe's problems. No boys for Europe. Stuff like that. All very anti-war stuff. Because at the time, the Soviet Union was still allied to Nazi Germany. They'd signed a non-aggression pact. They were allies. They'd carved up Poland between them. And Comrade Stalin had told the American Communist Party to keep you out of the war so Hitler could finish his job of conquering Europe and conquering Britain. So your American communists were basically trying to help a Nazi victory in Europe. But in 1941, Hitler betrayed Stalin and invaded the Soviet Union. And within 24 hours, the American peace mobilization became the American People's Mobilization, the most pro-war, let's get Hitler, let's crush the Nazis organisation in the country. 24 hours, painted out one word, put in the other. 24 hours, that's how deep the communist commitment to peace is. Peace when it suits them, war when it doesn't. And as long as you guys can supply the troops and the money, they're real happy. And Robert Taylor was an affiliate of that communist organisation and another communist organisation in Chicago, the Chicago Civil Liberties Committee. Both of them he served with a man called Frank Marshall Davis. The other side of Valerie Jarrett's family, her late father-in-law Vernon Jarrett, a black journalist in Chicago, very prominent. The last thing he did when he was dying of cancer in 2004 was to issue a call to the black population of South Chicago to get out and vote for Mr. Obama in that year's Senate primaries. Go back to 1946. Vernon Jarrett was serving on the Illinois State Executive of a wonderful sounding organisation. I'm sure you'd all love to support it. It was called American Youth for Democracy. And guess which political party it was the youth wing of?
Democrats.
Communist Party USA. Love to hide their intentions, these guys. 1948, Vernon Jarrett was serving on the Packing House Workers Strike Committee Publicity Committee. The Packing House Workers were a communist labour union out on strike, and Vernon Jarrett was writing their press releases and propaganda. And on that little publicity committee with Vernon Jarrett served a man called Frank Marshall Davis. So isn't it interesting that the two most powerful people in the United States, Valerie Jarrett and Barack Obama, can both trace their political heritage back to the Chicago Communist Party of the 1940s, and specifically to a man called Frank Marshall Davis. You wouldn't read about it, would you? Except in my book. So, the other half of Mr. Obama's brain, which doesn't leave very much, really. Joe Biden, perhaps. David Axelrod. David Axelrod, the man who got Obama elected against the Hillary Clinton machine and is now trying to re-engineer his election campaign from Chicago. David Axelrod wins his elections by blackening the name of his opponents and negative campaigning. I'm sure you've all seen that in this current campaign. That's all I've done. 2004, when Mr. Obama was running for the US Senate against Jack Ryan, a Republican who was easily favoured to win, some secret divorce records were illegally unsealed, someone was paid off, a sex scandal was uncovered, and Mr. Ryan was sunk, and Obama waltzed in. But where did Mr. Axelrod learn his tricks and his trade? Well, back in the 1970s, when David Axelrod moved to Hyde Park, Chicago, to study political science at the university, he was picked up and mentored for several years by two very prominent local journalist-activists, Don Rose and David S. Cantor. Now, before these three formed a team, they all worked together as a team on the Carol Mosley Brown campaign, on the second Harold Washington campaign. It was Don Rose that basically got Axelrod his first job in big-time journalism. But before these two guys picked up Axelrod, for several years they'd run a publication, about 8 years, in Chicago in Hyde Park called the Hyde Park Kenwood Voices. And it was the voice of the Hyde Park left. It carried articles about Quentin Young's trip to North Vietnam to give aid to the communists during the war. Articles about his son Ethan's trip to Cuba to cut sugarcane for Fidel Castro. It also had a regular column by a local congressman called Abner Mikva, He was very much part of their operation. And Mikva was a huge opponent of gun rights in Congress, campaigned relentlessly against them. When he left Congress, he became an open supporter, he was a Democrat of course, an open supporter of Democratic Socialists of America, and also a law professor at the University of Chicago. And while he was there, he became a mentor for several years to Mr. Obama. But he was also a mentor and a friend to another American lawyer who I'm sure you're all familiar with. And that is Elena Kagan, who now serves on your Supreme Court. And there was a long history with Democratic Socialists of America herself. One half of the partnership, Don Rose, long-time communist fronter, his Chicago Red Squad police file, describes him as a dangerous anarchist. In 1968, he coined the famous phrase, "The whole world is watching." And that was during the riots of Chicago of that year, which Mr. Rose helped to organise. He was later a long-time executive member with Timuel Black and Quentin Young of a wonderful Chicago organisation I'm sure you would all love to support, the Chicago Committee to Defend the Bill of Rights. Sounds great, doesn't it? Communist Party's main front in Chicago. The other half of the partnership, David Cantor. His father was a man called Harry Cantor, leader of the Massachusetts Communist Party in the 1930s. In 1932, he took his whole family, including baby David, to live in the Soviet Union for several years. Harry Cantor was given a personal audience with Comrade Stalin. He was given a job translating Lenin's works from Russian into English, which to a communist is the equivalent of being allowed to translate the Bible. He was a very important communist. After the war, after World War II, both Cantors, Harry and David, were back in the States living in Chicago and are not both members of the Communist Party. In 1948, Harry Cantor bought a little communist publication called the Chicago Star off its owner. And why do you think the owner wanted to sell it? Well, he was moving to Hawaii, because it was Frank Marshall Davis. Go forward to 1960. David Cantor and his best friend, Leroy Wolins, who incidentally was a Communist Party member who founded Veterans for Peace, another Communist Party anti-military front. They had a little publication company, Translation World Publishers. They weren't going capitalist. They were getting a regular subsidy from the Soviet Embassy in Washington to distribute communist literature all over your country. The two men were actually required by your government to formally register as agents of the Soviet Union. Go forward to 1964. Got any Goldwater girls or Goldwater guys here at all? Congratulations, good for you. He's a great man. There was a big race. Barry Goldwater, the Republican, Lyndon Johnson, the Democrat. Lyndon Johnson won. You got the Great Society, the biggest expansion of welfarism and federal power since the New Deal. And all your major cities are suffering for it still today. The other guy, Barry Goldwater, was a conservative, a patriot, a constitutionalist. Any people here from the Tea Party tonight? Yep, a few of you. Excellent. The Tea Party would have loved Barry Goldwater, and he would have loved the Tea Party. If he'd won that election, this country would be a lot stronger and a lot healthier today. But he didn't win. The Kennedy assassination did him in. But he was also viciously vilified in the press of this country as a racist, a fascist, and an extremist. Anybody here heard those terms in recent times?
Yeah.
Not surprising, especially if you're in the Tea Party. One of the main sources of if not the main sources of the vilification of Barry Goldwater was Translation World Publishers out of Chicago. David Cantor's little communist-run, Soviet-subsidised publication company. So your Mr. Axelrod got his training, served his apprenticeship at the hands of a Soviet-paid professional black propagandist and character assassin. So you wonder why Mr. Axelrod is as dirty and as ruthless as he is. Now that brings me to another very well-known member of the administration, but someone that may surprise you a little bit. Voted in 100-0 through your US Senate to his current position. Leon Panetta, your Secretary of Defence. 100-0 by the body charged with guarding your constitution and keeping your military strong. They put a man of his record into a position of that importance. I don't think they did any due diligence whatsoever, because Leon Panetta's public record alone should have given them grave cause for concern. Leon Panetta spent many years as a Democrat congressman out of Santa Cruz, California. Now the Santa Cruz Democrat Party is not the same as the Idaho Democrats or the Utah Democrats. It is a far-left, lunatic fringe, nutcase California Democrat Party. A little bit like your Ohio Democrat Party, but maybe not as extreme. Leon Panetta had members of Democratic Socialists of America on his campaign committees. He worked with them extensively. He put tributes in the congressional record to communist peace activists like Lucy Hassler. He basically spent most of his time in Congress agitating against Star Wars, trying to get the military budget cut, and complaining and bitching at Reagan for his policy of opposing communism in Latin America. Leon Panetta was a far-left, anti-military, peacenik Democrat. That's what his public record was. That's what he was known as. But what about his less than public record? Well, Leon and Sylvia Panetta were best friends in Santa Cruz, California, with a local couple called Hugh and Dorothy DeLacy. Hugh DeLacy, American Committee for the Protection of Foreign Born with Frank Marshall Davis. Now, the DeLacy's and Panettas had parties at each other's houses. They were friends for 9 or 10 years at least. And in 1986, when Hugh DeLacy died, they held a memorial service for him in Santa Cruz. 4 people read eulogies. One of them was Leon Panetta. All of the other 3 were members of Democratic Socialists of America. Hugh DeLacy and Leon Panetta had a whole series of correspondence going over 9 or 10 years, which I have, and all of it was moaning about US defence spending, saying how it had to be cut, how Reagan was a ratbag for opposing communism in Latin America. Leon Panetta even went down to Nicaragua to visit with those communists down there. It was all about cutting the US budget, military budget, all of it. That's the whole content of it. And Leon Panetta should have known that his friend Hugh DeLacy, was also going down to Nicaragua to visit with those communist Sandinistas, and was also going to Spain to visit with the Spanish Communist Party. But it didn't seem to worry him. But Hugh DeLacy had a little bit of a history too. Back in 1940, he was elected to the national executive of that wonderful organisation trying to keep you guys out of World War II, the American Peace Mobilization. In 1946, he was elected as a Democrat congressman out of Washington State, the Seattle area. And that was the time they used to talk about the 47 states of the Union and the Soviet of Washington. The communists ran the state through the labour unions. And Hugh DeLacy spent most of his time in Congress agitating for your government to abandon Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist Chinese armies and support Mao Zedong's communist Chinese armies. And it's not surprising he did that, because all the time he was in Congress, Hugh de Lacy was, and right up to the 1970s at least, Hugh de Lacy was a secret card-carrying member of the Communist Party USA. Certainly not the first secret communist in your Congress, and definitely not the last. Ask Dennis Kucinich about that one too. Then, but the devil looks after his own, and 1975, Hugh de Lacy hooked up with an old comrade from the 1940s, a Stanford University academic named John Stuart Service. The two men had worked together in the 40s on Chinese issues. John Stuart Service just happened to have been a member of the Amerasia Soviet spy ring, the people who gave China to the communists. And he helped to arrange in 1975 an all-expenses-paid visit to communist China for Hugh and Dorothy de Lacy. They spent a month over there in Beijing, all around the country, visiting collective farms, the factories, watching the kids wave the Maoist flags. But they also had time to visit with two American expatriates who were living there and kept corresponding with them afterwards. One guy was Frank Coe, the other one was Solomon Adler. Frank Coe was then working as a propagandist for the communist government. He was a former member of the Amerasia Soviet spy ring. The other guy was Solomon Adler, another former member of the Amerasia Soviet spy ring, at that time working as an advisor to the Chinese intelligence services, a live Chinese spy. Back in the United States, Hugh de Lacy was also corresponding with a communist out of Washington State, a guy called Don Wheeler, who in the 1940s had been a member of the Silver Master KGB spy ring in Washington, D.C. He was also corresponding with Victor Perlo from Connecticut, another communist and another former member of the Silver Master KGB spy ring. So Hugh de Lacy, best friends with your current Secretary of Defence, was a secret communist who personally knew 5 former KGB agents, one of whom was still a live Chinese agent. Now, anybody in this room ever gone through an FBI security check for a job, for a government job or whatever? A few of you here. Pretty extensive, aren't they? Background check, your family background, schoolmates, job history, associates. They practically go through your underwear drawers. It's important. This is security is important for a government job. But I ask you, if Leon Panetta applied for a job as a janitor in your nearest military base, and had to go through an FBI security clearance, how do you think you'd get on? How do you think Mr. Obama would get on? Well, he's good at it. But Hugh de Lacy was also serving at the time as a West Coast agent for a Marxist journal out of Chicago called In These Times. Now that was run by a man called James Weinstein, former Communist Party member, founder member of Democratic Socialists of America, and reportedly peripherally involved in the Rosenberg spy ring of the 1940s, the people who gave Stalin the A-bomb secrets. Now in 2002, James Weinstein and a whole bunch of Chicago communists set up a big anti-Iraq war rally in Federal Plaza in downtown Chicago. And at that rally, an Illinois state politician used the opportunity to make his name known nationwide as an opponent of the Iraq war. Put him on the map. Guess who that was? Barack Obama. So I repeat my claim. Barack Obama didn't make a movement made Barack Obama. And many elements of that movement do not owe allegiance to your country. Now that brings me to what I consider the real agenda of the left in this country. What is their number one priority? Their number one. Now, before I say what it is, I want to build up a little bit of credibility for an Albuquerque retired high school math teacher named Mark Rudd. Now, who is Mark Rudd? Mark Rudd was the brains of the Weather Underground terrorist organisation. He led the famous SDS riots at Columbia University in 1968, which closed the university down for weeks. In 1969, he was in Cuba training under a KGB major. In 2006, Mark Rudd and Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dawn and Jeff Jones, another Weather Underground leader, who incidentally helped to write Obama's stimulus package, got together with Tom Hayden and Angela Davis and David Graeber, one of the key founders of the Occupy movement, and a whole bunch of communists and socialists to set up a new radical organisation with another lovely sounding name, Movement for a Democratic Society. Thank you, Paul. And Movement for a Democratic Society was the adult support network for the new Students for a Democratic Society, the new student radicals that are active in campuses all over your country. But they also formed a little offshoot organisation in 2008, headed by Tom Hayden and two members of Democratic Socialists of America, Barbara Ehrenreich and Bill Fletcher Jr., and they called this one Progressives for Obama. And it was designed, and a whole bunch of Institute for Policy Studies people too. And this was designed to unite the left behind their candidate. And Mark Rudd endorsed Progressives for Obama. So basically, Mark Rudd is a key member of the United States left and knows people like Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dawn who have worked with Obama for many years. So when he predicts Obama's agenda and says where Obama wants to take this country, I give him some credibility. Now, in November 2008, just after the election, President-elect Obama appointed several conservatives to positions in this country's defence establishment. Conservatives. And some people on our side of the fence, poor naive souls, breathed a big sigh of relief. Oh, maybe he's going to be a moderate. Maybe we can trust this guy. Maybe he's going to play to the centre. But the left were absolutely spewing. They were livid. And Mark Rudd's inbox was filling up with emails from irate comrades from all over the country. What the heck is our man doing putting conservatives into the military-industrial complex? This is not what I campaigned for. And Mark Rudd knew he had a problem. He had to settle the comrades down, get them back on board with the agenda. So he wrote a little article for the Rag blog out of Texas, very widely read on the left, staffed by communists, weathermen, SDSs, a lot of people associated with Cuba. And this is what he said. He called it, Let's Get Smart About Obama, November 28, 2008, still online, it's in my book. And this is what he said to settle the comrades down, to get them back behind the president. Obama is a very strategic thinker. He knew precisely what it would take to get elected, and he didn't blow it. He knew he had to play to the centre to not be run over by the press, the Republicans, or to scare centrist voters away. He made it. So he has a narrow mandate for change. The economic agenda will stress stimulus to the bottom at times and handouts to the top at others. But never, never threaten the military budget. That will unite a huge majority of Congress against him. Leave the military alone because they're way too powerful for now. By the second or third year of this recession, people may begin to discuss cutting the military budget. So where are we now, folks? 3 years in, 4 years in. You're worried about your jobs, your businesses, paying your taxes, keeping your kids in college. America is focused on the economic issues. And while you're looking there, and who can blame you, smiling Leon Panetta is over at your Department of Defence right now, cutting your military to ribbons. Right. Huge chunks, 20% of US federal spending, the military budget is taking more than 50% of the cuts. Way over. Plus your space program, which is really part of the military, is also being cut to ribbons. Huge chunks out of the army, huge chunks out of the navy, weapon systems cancelled willy-nilly, new fighter jets just cast aside. Cuts everywhere. Talk to any military person. All over the place. Mr. Obama has even commissioned a paper, which he wants to put forward, and he will if he gets another term, to cut the US nuclear arsenal down to 292 nuclear weapons. You used to have more than 6,000 of them. The Russians alone have more than 1,500 that we know about, and the best civil defence system in the world. They wouldn't even notice 292 nukes, even if they got off the ground. Now, what was Mr. Obama talking about in March in Korea? Talking about missile defence to then Russian President Dmitry Medvedev. Off mic, so he thought. No one was supposed to be listening. I need more space, Mr. Medvedev. When I get re-elected, I'll have more flexibility to deal with you. Medvedev says, yes, I understand. I will pass your message on to Vladimir. We are with you. That is the single most important thing your president has said in his entire term of office. Because that is the agenda of the left. That's what Frank Marshall Davis wanted. That's what Alice Palmer wanted. That's what the people behind Valerie Jarrett wanted. That's what the people behind David Axelrod wanted. And that is certainly what the people behind Leon Panetta wanted. And guess what? That's what they're getting. And you project this forward 4 more years, folks. Obama gets 4 more years. How much military do you think you will have left? How effective will it be? And you think about this, 4 more years, your military is gutted, absolutely gutted. China has built up its blue water navy. Russia has rearmed. Iran has nukes coming out their ears. North Korea has perfected their electromagnetic pulse weapons, one of which could put your country back into the horse and buggy age. Europe has collapsed. Islamic communist revolution has taken over most of the Middle East. Israel is hanging on by a thread. Communism has conquered all of Latin America instead of 80% of it. And some American stands up and says, I'm going to be president of this country and I'm going to restore the United States military to its former glory. I'm going to make America the #1 military power in the world again. Do you think for one moment Russia and China and Iran and all of their crazy allies, and they're all working together with radical Islam against you, do you think for one moment they'd sit back and let you do it? When they've got you exactly where they finally want you? At their mercy? Do you think they're going to let you out of the trap?
Not really.
So at that point, not only will you not be able to defend your allies around the world like Israel or Australia or Japan, you'll not even be able to defend your homeland. And you will have little choice but to be incorporated into some sort of United Nations world superstate, or face the combined military might of Russia and China and Iran and all of their allies with not a friend in the world to come to your aid. Could that be a bit of a worry? Perhaps? Mark Rudd wasn't quite finished. He went on to say, I'm not much of an athlete. Obama plays basketball. I'm not much of an athlete. I barely know the game. But one thing I do know is you have to be able to look like you're doing one thing but do another. That is why all these conservative appointments are important. The strategy is to feint right, move left. Any other strategy invites sure defeat. So surely that's an admission by Mr. Rudd that his president had a strategy for scamming his way into the White House by pretending to be a moderate, even fainting right at times, but his real agenda has always been to the far left, and that he has got your military as his number one target. And Mark Rudd seems to know about this somehow. But I don't want to depress you folks with all of that, or bring you down in any way. Am I too late? A little bit. Look, if I thought there was no hope for America, I'd be back in New Zealand right now, building bunkers and stocking up on baked beans. Okay? And I'm not mocking prepping for 1 minute. You should all be doing it, regardless of who wins. But look, in 2008, those 60s radicals who've been infiltrating every sector of your society, the ones who failed to have their revolution in the 60s, in 2008, they had the House, they had the Senate, and they had the White House. And they had their man in the Oval Office. All their ducks were finally in a row, and they were going to get their revolution. They were going to get their revenge. They were going to steamroll Middle America out of existence once and for all. The great Satan was about to go down. But in 2009, something miraculous happened. Glenn Beck, the Tea Party movement, conservatives, conservative church people and pastors started standing up. They overplayed their hand and they awoke a sleeping giant. And you people here in this room, and your hundreds of thousands of people like you all over this country, stood up and you stopped the agenda of the left stone cold dead. And I'll tell you what, they hate you for it, which is why I love you for it. Because you think about it, folks, if that hadn't happened in 2009, 2010, if you hadn't blogged and emailed and agitated and marched and campaigned and changed the culture of this country, if you hadn't taken back the House in 2010, you'd have cap and trade now, you'd have card check, you'd have comprehensive immigration reform, 8 million illegal aliens would be voting in this election, you'd already have Obamacare, you would be in major, major trouble. But you guys, by standing up, saved your republic and gave it a second chance. But more than that, you kick-started what I call the Second American Revolution. And this is 1773. And you think back, you don't know what you've started here, folks. You think back to those first revolutionaries. Do you think they had any idea of the amazing republic they were creating? Any inkling at all? And I go around, I talk to Tea Party folk all around this country and conservative groups and all that sort of thing. They all say to me, this is tough going, nobody's listening, nobody cares, whatever. But I come to you as an outsider, someone who's been all over this country, and I'll tell you, I am absolutely blown away what a bunch of political novices, most of you, have achieved in 3 years. You've changed the culture of this country. You've changed the GOP. You're in the school boards now, the county commissions. You're getting rid of rhino Republicans. You are altering this country in ways you cannot begin to comprehend. And you think if it's tough now, folks, you think back to that first American Revolution. A bunch of farmers, shopkeepers, lawyers, blacksmiths, seamstresses, fishermen, and I've got to say pastors, Bible in one hand, long rifle in the other, united by the ideals of liberty, took on the greatest military empire the world had known to that point and beat them. And how miraculous is that? So we got a choice, folks. The revolution is going on now, but there's a big thing, a big battle in a few days' time. There's still a few days left to change things. Ohio is a key state. Josh Mandel in the Senate would be a huge boost. And Mitt Romney winning this state is absolutely essential. And it can be done. And it can be done with your help. I'd just like to say, if you're in a position to do anything towards that, 4 or 5 days hard work could be the greatest 4 or 5 days you ever put in your life politically. Could make all the difference. Could come down to the wire. And we all look back, don't we? We all look back to those first American revolutionaries for inspiration. Those guys who went all through that privation, all through that starvation, put their lives on the line, they lost their fortunes, they put everything into a hopeless cause, and they prevailed. But how about looking forward for some inspiration? If you don't think you want to get involved, you think about 200 years' time, in some civics class in a high school in this town, some young kid will get up in front of his classmates and he'll say, "Guess what, guys? Guess what?" He said, he'll be so proud. He'll say, "I did some research into my family background. You know what I found? My great-great-great-great-great-great-grandma and granddaddy, they were in the Tea Party. They were part of the Second American Revolution." And in those dark days in the early 2000s, when a lot of people thought this country was done, they stood up and they saved the Republic. And the liberty and prosperity we have today, we owe to what they did back then. And can you guys think of any political movement that is cooler to be part of than that? Anything more noble? So I just want to say to you folk, thank you so much for what you're doing for your country, for liberty, and for my country. Thank you very much, and God bless America. Thank you.
We'll take question and answer here just in a minute.